The Western Front, December 1914. Imagine the sound of World War I. The first thing that comes to mind is the noise. The relentless, thundering drumbeat of artillery. The sharp crack of sniper fire. The screams of men, the rattle of machine guns, and the squelch of boots in deep, freezing mud. For 5 months since August of that year, this cacophony was the soundtrack of Europe. An industrial slaughter that had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. But then, on a freezing Christmas Eve, something terrifying happened. The noise stopped. Veterans would later write that the silence was more unnerving than the shelling. When the guns go silent in war, it usually means an attack is coming. Men gripped their rifles tighter, staring into the dark, freezing mist of no man's land. They waited for the charge. They waited for the scream of whistles. Instead, they heard singing. It started on the German lines. A deep baritone swell of voices rising from the trenches. They weren't singing martial songs or anthems of hate. They were singing Still Nacht, Silent Night. What followed is perhaps the most famous and most mythologized event in the history of warfare. The Christmas Truce of 1914. It is a story we think we know. The football match, the gifts, the shared cigars, the moment humanity triumphed over hatred. But the true story is far more complex, far darker, and in many ways far more profound than the picture-perfect legend we are often sold. Today, we are going to walk through the frozen mud of Flanders to separate the myth from the reality. We will look at what actually happened during those few strange days in 1914, and perhaps more importantly, why it never happened again. To understand the miracle, you first have to understand the misery. By December 1914, the Home by Christmas slogan had turned into a bitter joke. The mobile war of the summer had died. The German advance had been halted at the Marne, and both sides had engaged in the race to the sea, trying to outflank each other until they ran out of land. The result was a scar of trenches running from the Swiss border all the way to the North Sea. The conditions were apocalyptic. It had been raining for weeks. Trenches were not yet the reinforced engineering feats they would become later in the war. They were essentially ditches filled with freezing water, urine, and decaying bodies. Frostbite and trench foot were rampant. The proximity of the enemy was claustrophobic. In some places, the British and German lines were only 30 yards apart. You could smell the enemy's cooking. You could hear them coughing. It was in this pressure cooker of misery that the Vatican tried to intervene. Earlier in December, Pope Benedict XV had called for a truce of God. He asked that the guns fall silent at least upon the night the angels sang. The response from the governments was a resounding no. The German commanders were willing to entertain the idea, but the British and French commanders rejected it outright. They feared that a lull in fighting would dampen the fighting spirit. They were worried that if the men stopped killing, they might not start again. As it turns out, the generals were right to be worried. The truce wasn't a top-down order. It was a bottom-up rebellion. It was organic, chaotic, and dangerous. It began on Christmas Eve. The weather turned. A hard frost set in, freezing the mud and clearing the mist. The Germans had received thousands of small Christmas trees, Tannenbaum, sent to the front by the Kaiser to boost morale. They began placing these small, candle-lit trees along the parapets of their trenches. To the British watching through periscopes, it looked bizarre. Hundreds of tiny lights flickering in the darkness. Then came the carols. The British responded with their own. The first Noel answered Silent Night. Soon, shouting began across the gap. Hello Fritz, hello Tommy. It was a tentative, dangerous game. At any moment, a trigger-happy sentry or a nervous machine gunner could have turned the scene into a massacre. But no one fired. The real breakthrough came the next morning, Christmas Day. In the gray light of dawn, men began to climb out of the trenches. They didn't have weapons. They had hands raised. This is where the popular image of the truce takes over. We picture a sudden, universal peace across the entire front. The reality was much more patchwork. The truce did not happen everywhere. In some sectors, the fighting continued as brutally as ever. In others, officers threatened to shoot any man who showed his head above the parapet. But along roughly two-thirds of the British-German sector, the peace held. Men met in the middle of no man's land. This was the forbidden zone, a landscape of craters and corpses. And yet here they were shaking hands. The interactions were fascinatingly mundane. They didn't discuss grand politics or the reasons for the war. They talked about the weather. They swapped simple luxuries. The Germans loved British bully beef and jam. The British were desperate for the superior German cigars and sausages. They exchanged buttons, belt buckles, and hats as souvenirs. One British soldier, Private Frederick Heath, wrote in a letter home, "All through the night we sang. And in the morning, the Germans came out of their trenches and we went out of ours. We met in the middle and shook hands. We exchanged cigarettes and told each other that we didn't want a fight. But amidst the fraternity, there was a grim necessity. The truce provided the first opportunity in weeks to bury the dead. No man's land was littered with bodies from attacks in the days prior. The ground was too frozen to dig deep, so British and German soldiers worked side by side to hack at the earth, creating mass graves. In one sector, they held a joint burial service. A British chaplain read the 23rd Psalm, and a German divinity student read it in German. It was a moment of shared grief that transcended the uniform. And now, we must address the elephant in the room. The football match. If you ask anyone about the Christmas Truce, they will tell you about the soccer game. The story goes that the British and Germans played a proper match with a referee, and the Germans won 3-2. It is a wonderful story. It is the centerpiece of movies and commercials. But did it actually happen? Historians have spent decades debating this. The reality is that there was no singular, organized international match with goalposts and a referee. The ground was shell-shocked, covered in craters and barbed wire. You couldn't play a regulation game there if you wanted to. However, the myth isn't entirely a lie. It's an exaggeration of the truth. There were kickabouts. There are numerous letters and diary entries that mention balls, often made of rags or straw tied up with string, being kicked around in no man's land. It was chaotic, with dozens of men on each side chasing a makeshift ball in the mud. A letter from a British doctor in the Rifle Brigade mentions a match played between them and the Prussians, ending in a draw. Another German lieutenant claimed his unit played the English and won 3-2, which is likely where the specific score legend comes from. But these were isolated, informal scuffles, not the organized sporting event often depicted. So while the grand match is a myth, the spirit of it is real. Men who had been trying to kill each other hours before were indeed playing together in the mud. But this peace was fragile and it was doomed. High up in the chain of command, the reaction was apoplectic. General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, a British commander, was furious when he heard reports of the truce. He issued strict orders. "Friendly intercourse with the enemy," he wrote, "destroys the offensive spirit in all ranks." He warned that such apathy and lack of aggression would essentially lose them the war. The French command was even harsher, though the truce was less common in the French sectors due to the deep bitterness of the invasion of their homeland. For the French, the Germans weren't just opponents. They were occupiers. As Christmas Day turned into Boxing Day, the pressure to resume fighting increased. In some sectors, the truce dragged on for a few days, even until New Year's in very isolated spots. But the officers were reasserting control. The end of the truce was often tragic. In many places, it didn't end with a bang, but with a reluctant whimper. Officers would meet in no man's land, salute, and say, "At 4:00 p.m. we start firing." Men shook hands one last time and climbed back into their holes. Captain Stockwell of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers described how he fired 3 shots into the air to signal the end of the truce. The German captain opposite him appeared on the parapet, bowed, and disappeared. The war was back on. But in other places, it was more brutal. Artillery was called in specifically to break up groups of fraternizing soldiers. Snipers were ordered to shoot to kill anyone showing themselves. The trust that had been built over 24 hours was shattered by the return of industrial violence. What makes the Christmas truce so haunting is not just that it happened, but that it was the last of its kind. In 1915, as Christmas approached, the high commands on both sides were prepared. They issued draconian orders. Any fraternization would be met with court-martial and execution. They ordered artillery barrages on Christmas Eve, specifically to drown out any singing. Furthermore, the war had changed. By late 1915, poison gas had been used. The death tolls had risen into the millions. The innocence of 1914 was gone. The hatred had hardened. The enemy was no longer Fritz or Tommy, a man just like you. He was a monster who had gassed your friends. The Christmas Truce of 1914 stands as a singular, strange monument in history. It wasn't a mutiny exactly. It wasn't a political protest. It was a momentary assertion of humanity. For a few hours, the men in the mud decided that they had more in common with the enemy across the field than they did with the generals in the chateaus behind the lines. It is easy to romanticize it, to view it as a lost opportunity for peace. People often ask, what if they had just refused to start fighting again? But that is 21st century wishful thinking. These men were soldiers. They were patriotic. They believed in their nation's causes. They went back to fighting because that was their duty, and because the machinery of war was too big for a few thousand freezing men to stop. The reality of the truce is perhaps more powerful than the myth. It wasn't a magical football match that solved everything. It was a gritty, freezing, desperate grasp for normalcy in a world gone mad. It was burying the dead. It was sharing a smoke. It was looking a man in the eye and seeing a human being, knowing that tomorrow you would have to kill him. That is the true legacy of Christmas 1914. It reminds us that wars are fought by people, not pawns. And even in the darkest, coldest corners of history, the human spirit, battered, muddy, and freezing, can still, for a brief moment, shine through. Thank you for watching. If you want to uncover more hidden history, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments. Do you think a truce like this could ever happen in modern warfare?